Hello, I'm Angeline Acharyia, and I'm here to actually share with you a presentation on how you as a brand and an organization can win the hearts and minds of the Chinese consumer. So if you're thinking about export to China, or you already are and you want to win the long game into China, as I say, then this is a presentation that you must certainly hear. So let's start. Effectively, if you start to look at Australia's opportunity into China, one of the things that we say at Monash Food Innovation is that you need to be the deli into China. And by deli, we mean a supplier of high-value premium foods and beverages and agri-food as well. So, and the reason for this is, if you think about it, in terms of Australia, we need to be globally competitive. The way that we can be globally competitive is by making sure that we get a good return on our innovation investment. So given the high labour cost market here, given high utilities and a very complex supply chain where we have to, grow food, to convert food and then to send it into countries like China, we must absolutely make sure that we win in that by being a premium supplier of high value foods and beverages going through. When we look at innovation, usually in fast-moving consumer goods globally, what happens is most companies follow a very traditional approach, which you can see on this slide. And effectively what happens is 90% of products fail in the first 12 months of launch. So what that means is we need to really look at ways to de-risk your innovation, particularly in a market like China. And one of the ways that at Monash Food Innovation we help you to do that is to enhance your chances of success. And part of that is by really understanding the consumer or the end user, as we say, the culture. China has a very diverse culture, and you can't just assume that, if you do some work in tier 1 city, that's going to actually translate across to tier 2 and tier 3. So the culture is absolutely important, and also making sure that you're market led. And as you develop your innovation, starting very much with the consumer and the end user in mind, you must also manage to de-risk your failure points along that journey. And that's one way that we help you increase your odds of success 3 to 5 times in the marketplace. So when we talk about increasing your chance of innovation, really successful innovation comes from identifying opportunities at the front end of the innovation journey. And this is really critical because in our experience, and certainly in my years of experience over 20 years working in FMCG, food service and QSR globally, you tend to find a lot of companies don't spend enough time in what I call insight and understanding. So really ensuring that you do discover and, enable that front-end process to happen so that you can take those insights and translate them into actionable, insights and attributes into the product and the pack, the comms, as well as the claims that you can make. And the process that we use here is around knowledge mapping, product mapping, and using consumers in a qualitative as well as a quantitative approach to land you into what we call design guidelines. And the next few slides, I'm going to take you through an example of how we do that. So it always starts with knowledge, and knowledge mapping is effectively, starting with what is out there. And I'm sure all of you do this to some extent. Effectively, what we want to be able to do is to look at knowledge. And knowledge, if you're looking at exporting to China, there is a lot of it available online. You can go to your state-based government agencies. So in Victoria, it's Global Victoria, and as well as national agencies such as Austrade as well. And they have a lot of data at their fingertips that they can certainly provide access to you. So whether that's looking at market data, it's looking at category data, it's looking at competitive set, it's looking at different retail environments. And effectively what we're trying to do is to get your knowledge in a format that you can start to then pull out and create some hypotheses. So based on, say, if you were exporting a beverage into China, what are the kinds of important things that you need to know about the product, the consumer, the market, the channel, the regulatory impact? And this is what knowledge mapping as a process does. You then move that and follow that into what's called product mapping. And very important, because product mapping actually helps you identify what we call the white space. And let me jump into that as an example in here. So you can see here that we did a piece of work where we basically asked Chinese millennials and to understand what their perception was around different beverages that are available. And you can see a number of different categories here that the consumer was quickly able to provide us some feedback. And we then went from a qualitative process to hearing the consumer's feedback, observing how they actually interacted and used the product, to then identifying what I would call the white space. And basically a product map is what you see here. It's a 2x2 axis. In here, we actually categorized from what we heard, the attributes that were important to the consumer. And it was not tasty versus healthy versus unhealthy. And effectively, all of those products you saw in the previous slides, the consumer now doesn't map. We hear the attributes and then we map it for them. And what you see in the star is effectively what we created or found an opportunity for what's called flavored water as a potential way for a manufacturer to be able to get into this space, which was effectively a white space that was currently not being met. From here, what you can then do is start to identify, about premium. So what I spoke about, how do you really design for high value premium? This slide is a great example of looking at the 3 drivers that can design a premium bottled water. So one is around obviously the water itself, the sources, the great provenance story behind it. The second is about the brand, and part of the brand is understanding the brand drivers, the perception of the brand name as well is very important. And the third and the most important lever that I think is also packaging. So what should your product pack look like? What are the colors? What are the attributes? What are the semiotics from a Chinese millennial cultural nuances that you need to start to target in terms of designing your pack? And the piece of work in terms of a solution that came out is if you're looking at premium packaging design, you can see on this slide on the left side are some premium packaging water that is already sold in China at the point in time where we did some of this work. And on the right side, you can actually see what are the attributes that were really, really important to the Chinese millennial consumer. So it was about simple and being in, simplicity. That was really important. It had to be elegant in style. It had to depart away from conventional bottled water attributes, less colors. So again, going back to that simplicity. Glass, it was certainly seen as preferred, but it was also inconvenient to carry and heavy. So how can you actually have a glass look, but maybe, answer to some of those attributes? Had to be easy to hold. Wide opening was absolutely encouraged, less edges and corners. And you can see some of the verbatims that the consumer really said in here. So what it starts to really now drive us to is before you even think about what goes inside the bottle is what the bottle should look like. Because at the end of the day, this is a thing that's going to cut through and jump into the basket or offline into, the checkout basket as well. So some examples, of, some companies that we have helped with, and it is quite broad. So we did some work with an olive-based company who really had spent a fair bit of time looking at an opportunity to develop a product for the Chinese market and had done a fair bit of research and a fair bit of work. By the time they came to us, we only had one question for them. And the question was, what is the perception of olive-based products in the Chinese consumer's mind? That was a question they really couldn't answer, even though they had done a fair bit of concept development. But again, they actually hadn't checked in with the consumer and the marketplace in the first step. And what we helped them really define was, what was the perception of olive-based products? So did the Chinese think olive was healthy? We do in Australia, but that doesn't necessarily always translate into other markets. We also, ended up finding things like that, olive is not perceived as healthy in China at that point. So what that meant for the company, it wasn't like they couldn't launch into into China straight away, it meant that they had to be very careful about the education that was needed for olive-based products. Another project that we worked on was, and again, this is a really great, understanding of the regulatory market in China. So it was a frozen meal. We were looking at, how do you get a frozen meal into China, because this company currently makes a lot of frozen meals in Australia, and they saw it as a big opportunity. Now, one of the first questions that came to mind is, what is the perception of frozen meals in China? Will the Chinese actually buy and stock food and frozen food and be able to, take it out, zap it in a microwave or in an oven, because they have a lot of fresh product that is already available and at a really reasonable cost. So the piece of work that we did was to really identify and understand what was the market opportunity for frozen meals in China. What was the perception of frozen meals? Was that an opportunity for a Chinese person to actually buy this on their way home and therefore use it for a dinner meal, or was it more about lunchtime? And the other piece that we found from a regulatory perspective was just the definition of the same regs and same standard, that it was interpreted differently. So, for instance, you could actually put a protein and a carb together, but not a protein, carb, and vegetable. And it was kind of, interpreted very differently in different ports, depending on whether you went through Guangzhou or Shanghai at that point in time. So a great example of showing that as you start your innovation, don't forget your regulatory piece. Do that right up front and in parallel. My next slide sort of takes you through some of the key questions, and these are certainly based from all of our experience having worked in the markets like China and other Asian markets. It's really about trying to identify the market and the opportunity, as I said, the gaps and the needs. Can you currently lift and launch your current offer that you have? And some people say, well, if it works here, it should work there. And I think, we all know some of the 3 or 4 examples of that, but not all examples always work. What do you need to modify? And I would absolutely, suggest you think about packaging as a big one. Of course, the consumer piece. And remember the competitive advantage that you have, not just the fact that you are an Australian manufactured product, therefore you have clean, green and safe, but really what is your unique difference? What is unique about your offer that others cannot copy globally? And therefore that leads you to be a more premium offer as well. And as you look at this globally, when we look at products that are successful, here's a list of things, but there's really 2 that I really want to highlight is, we always know the products that stick longer on shelf, as I say, are those that are unique and differentiated. So regardless of the fact that, yes, we are Australia, we are clean, green and safe, that is now entry, guys. Probably 5 years ago, we could hang our hats on it. I think now you just absolutely need to be unique and differentiated and very hard to copy in a market that has thousands of products as your competitive set. And making sure that, you really define that product definition. So your attributes around your product, the attributes around packaging, and therefore the whole brand and product story that you need to tell is going to be absolutely critical in being successful. And on the other side, there are always reasons why failure happens. If you think back to my stat about only 10% of products that are successful, and a lot of it is because of marketing analysis. Now, these numbers never add up to 100%, and it's really to give you some really broad effects. But effectively, in our experience, what we've learned is when you haven't really understood the market, and by the market, I mean the consumer, the channel, the cultural nuances that, are very, very important to know when you're thinking about export into Asia and export in particular into China. And of course, this slide, it is always west is not east, and it's a really a way that I want to try and, help you really consider and start to question and almost challenge your own assumptions. Because as I said, there are, depending on the work that you do, even if you work in a tier 1 city and you get some feedback, doesn't mean that can translate into a tier 3 city. China as a market continues to evolve rapidly, and pretty much, every time we're there is something that is changing. It is highly advanced. The consumer is highly aspirational as well, and is really challenging, I think, brands and the status quo in terms of how they make choices on purchase. This slide is from our partners at COFCO, and effectively it tells you about, some of the things that are probably really important for a Chinese consumer around quality, around nutrition, around variety and convenience. In particular, I want to point out one bit, and that is around nutrition. So about a third of the Chinese population is meant to be type 2 diabetes by 2030. Now, that means that's a lot of people who will actually need to understand how to regulate sugar and how to choose much more choicefully around diets. And I think it's a huge opportunity if you're an Australian brand and a manufacturer here to start to target something like that as well. So how do you make it happen, and how do we help you make it happen? So what we've basically done is looked at, and actually we've formed a really unique partnership with COFCO, and COFCO also own Walmart.com, which is a boutique F&B online channel as well. So COFCO is the China Oil Food Corporation. It is an agri-food commodity business, and it is very, very big. It's a $100 billion entity. They do everything from manufacturing to trade to processing. And what we have formed for Australian manufacturers is an exclusive partnership with COFCO's Nutrition Health Research Institute, which is NHRI. And effectively, they mirror my team's capability here at Monash, and they can do consumer sensory evaluations, or whether that's qualitatively or quantitatively, food safety, as well as really help us define, a successful way to de-risk your innovation into marketplace before you land into China. As I say, it's a long game, and you want to make sure that your investment is right on the money from the start. So if we look at this slide, it is really all about de-risking. It's about defining and refining and validating your product offer in China before you press go. So the first part of the slide shows you some of the consumer shopper sensory capabilities that we have access to in COFCO, which really can help you define the taste profile of your product concept, your packaging, and making sure it is tested in the place of reality, as I say, plus with really good consumer feedback that can help articulate into what the design needs to be. On the same pathway, we have a partnership with CCICA, which is a China Inspection Certificate Authority of Australia, and effectively they are experts in Chinese regulatory. So they can help you from label compliance all the way through to getting a CIQ certification as well as CNCC registration, depending on the category that you play in. And as you move through, I guess some of the things that our China team say that are very important, and also capabilities that we have in addition in COFCO that allows you to absolutely fail fast and fix fast, is anything from consumer insight to neuroscience, so being able to do eye tracking, facial analysis, particularly if you have online and using online communities to be able to do very fast research between online and offline, market research, data and information, including using big data, as well as sensory testing and profiling to make sure that you're really targeting the right consumer palette as well. The other piece that I wanted to just very quickly share, so one of the things that at Monash we're working on is we have a joint Australia-China research centre that is run by one of our professors here called Professor Cordelia Simulia. And basically Cordelia has set up a virtual centre, if you will, between Australia and Chinese research institutes as well as manufacturers. So COFCO, Mengniu are involved. On China's side, on this side, we have Fonterra, Gardner, Bega as well as Saputo. And effectively, these organizations are working on helping define what is the future technologies needed for dairy manufacturing. So it's an example if you're sitting there as an industry sector and going, I need to do this for wine, or I need to do this for horticulture, things like these can be set up, and really making sure that we delve not into the actual technology and the research needed, but then the application of that back into the marketplace. And my last tip for you is what I call the rise and rise of functional foods, because I think you can't look at China and go, what is next? And this sort of gives you an example of, the forecast of functional foods based on some of the health issues that I mentioned as well. So if you are playing in any of these areas, or if you're looking at adding functional ingredients to your product offer, then certainly the Chinese consumer is going to be looking for these and demanding this into the future. And here's my tips, I guess, in terms of exporting to China. And I'm sure you've seen many of these around, but, the consumer is changing rapidly. I think even if you're in China every 6 months or every 3 months, it is rapid change at high velocity. So don't just sit here and assume that you know that market and that consumer. They do tend to favor a lot of foreign brands, and I think that's a big tick for Australia. But making sure that you can localize it, right? There are many examples that you can see brands doing that, brands like KFC or brands like Oreo that have done that. And product safety, absolutely critical. Food fraud is the #1 fraud in China. So you must make sure that the food is safe. And unfortunately, there have been a number of very, terrible mistakes over the years. Make sure you do find a local partner, and face matters in China. So if you are looking at, doing business in China, go through and do a way to do business with Chinese. So AsiaLink offers some great capability, and they're probably very good at being able to train you up and give you some tips around that. And I guess overlay this, absolutely regulatory. You must be mindful of a very rapidly changing regulatory landscape in China. IP, I always say, even if you just dream of China, protect your brand and your products early. And then, of course, WeChat. It's a great platform. A lot of Chinese use it. And, your brands can certainly be made, and not to mention the whole Daigou channel as well, which is someone who you need on your side for sure. So just to bring it into summary, effectively what we have is a pathway that helps to de-risk your approach into China. We have a number of partners that you can see here on the left side. So COFCO enables you to really rapidly de-risk your innovation. Sense check with the consumer and the market. CCICA helps you around your regulatory strategy and your regulatory approach. AsiaLink Business can help you around understanding the market, the strategy piece as well. And Alibaba, of course, through the e-commerce channels, or Vic Farm is another one of our partners who can help you through bricks and mortar as well. So there are many opportunities. And I think, as always, you must make sure that, you are most informed as you go through this, because the road to China is a long one. And in my last slide, I always try and leave it with 3 things. So hopefully today what I've shared with you is some information around how do you really focus, in the front end of the innovation funnel, making sure that you understand the market, the consumer, the channel that you're going in. But also I showed you a methodology and approach where you can really identify the product design, the pack design, the comms, and the claims that you need to make in that example through product knowledge mapping and product mapping. And lastly, I showed you a pathway with a number of our partners here at Monash Food Innovation that can help you de-risk to enter China. I hope this webinar was successful, and do reach out if we can help you. Thank you.